Savage Night of the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Back 17 years ago, I found myself involved with a young woman that I never should have become involved with. Somehow I ended up in Washington State, driving home to Canada North along the coastline in an old car known for breaking down suddenly. I had never driven through this area and I felt entirely alone and vulnerable. Then the fog set in, so thick that I feared I might have to pull off the road. If I had known that something like the Dogman lurked in that fog, I would have risked it and just kept driving. But how could I have foreseen that? The Pacific Northwest is known for Bigfoot sightings, sure, but Dogman? I hadn't even heard of the Dogman. I had family back then who lived in the eastern suburbs of New York City, and this location in Washington has a lot of the same town names as over there. Long Beach, Long Island. It made the entire situation that much more surreal to be driving through. I don't know how old you are or how long it's been since you got dumped hard by someone that you cared about, but this was my first time coping with a breakup, and I was extremely emotional. The stereotype is that women fall apart upon loss of a relationship, while men hold a stiff upper lip. The statistics and facts actually show that women are more often fine, but men resort to self-harm or even self-deletion when losing the love of the person they admire most deeply. I didn't know those facts back then, though, and so I was experiencing extreme emotions, and that meant to me that I was weak. My contempt with my own failure to cope with rejection only caused me to be even more emotional and even more out of control and desperately unhappy. Most people have had a few breakups by the time they were my age. I think I was 21 back then. But this was the first time I had gone through anything like this, and it felt like the end of the world. Get to the point, I hear the less intelligent of you out there chanting. Well, in the years since this experience, I've come to believe that this precisely is the point. I was having very extreme emotional issues, and that is why I think the Dogman walked into my life. If you leave that part of the story out, then you're lying to yourself about what the Dogman is. The Dogman is a killer, yes, and I learned that personally as I'm about to tell you, but that doesn't mean it exists in the normal sense. You're never going to see a Dogman in the San Diego Zoo, but that doesn't mean it can't catch you and end your story for good. Recently, I saw David Paulides' video, and he talked of Eastern or Asian beliefs about people who disappear under strange circumstances. They're usually, according to that worldview, people who are experiencing extreme emotions. They may encounter seemingly otherworldly beings. They may find themselves in odd locations, even on top of the roof of a building, with no memory of how they got there. They may disappear permanently, or they may show up again in a location which has already been searched more than once. I have a theory about this, based partially on what I've read, and partially on what I've experienced personally. Now hear me out. I think that a lot of the world is actually existing outside of us, but we never experience it as anything but a very personal experience in our minds. When our minds become stressed, we can begin to find our worldview cracking apart. If the outside world were entirely stable as materialists think, then our stressed out minds would still be reacting to a normal world. But, and here is my big but, and I cannot lie, what if the world is formed half out of what we might call material, or materialism, and half out of our own emotional state? What if our own consciousness collaborates with what is around it to create its own reality? In that case, the more upset or unhappy we are, the more likely we are to exit consensus reality and enter a world inhabited by ghosts and ghoulies and, of course, the Dogman. In other words, if we're around other people and everything is normal, We're more likely to see, hear, touch, smell, and feel the same thing as everyone else. But once we are isolated, alone, frightened, rejected, emotionally traumatized, and scared, we're far more likely to find ourselves living in our very own private nightmare world. If you don't agree with me, that's okay, but it's my explanation of what happened to me on that creepy, foggy day back in 2004 when I was a young man. A fog settled over the water I found myself driving alongside, just as a fog had settled over my mind. It was light at first, and then soon I couldn't even see the Pacific Ocean to my left any longer. It became such an issue that I couldn't see more than 1 or 2 car lengths in front of or behind me, and I couldn't tell if it was day or night. I wasn't sure if there was traffic, or if I was driving alone on the narrow highway. The similarity of place names to locations I had loved staying at when I was a child was also interfering with my mental processes. I wanted nothing more than to pull off at Long Beach and stay with my Aunt Hildy, or visit my paternal grandmother who lived in Long Island back then. I wished I could curl up in a ball and sleep for a month until the pain went away, being soothed by chicken soup and soothing conversation with these women who I knew still loved me, even if the woman I had hoped to marry never would again. Let's face it, I was a wreck. When I finally admitted I was losing the battle with the fog, I pulled off of the road, put on my blinkers in hopes that would protect me from someone with a similar idea accidentally rear-ending me, and I put my head down to rest and to feel all the self-pity that I felt like I needed to allow myself. And when I was that age, believe me, I allowed myself a whole lot of self-pity. I'm not sure if I had fallen asleep or if I was just numb at that point, but when something banged hard into my car, I leaped up in my seat and I looked around. At first I saw nothing out there but the swirling fog moving around me like a living thing, swallowing me and my car up as though we were in the middle of a cloud in the sky. I felt a jolt again, and this time I had seen dark hands shoving my car from the passenger side. Dark hands that materialized, then disappeared into the mist again. Panic ran through me. Was I losing my mind? Was I imagining things? Onto the hood of my car leaped a man-thing from a deranged person's worst nightmare. It was squatting like a frog a foot away from my face, looking in the windshield at me with 2 glowing eyes, positioned on the front end of its dog-like face, which told me that it had binocular vision. That most likely meant that, assuming this was real and not a hallucination, the creature was a hunter, a meat-eater. It needed to see me in 3-dimensional space so that it could hunt me down and eat me. These were the thoughts going through my damaged mind as I noticed the black fur covering its body, which was far less canine than the head. In fact, the body was essentially human in shape. It had arms. It had legs. It was clearly an upright creature that was apparent even in its current squatting state. There is no creature like this in all of existence, according to mainstream science or zoology. I had pulled off of the road into a Twilight Zone nightmare. I tried to start my engine, but of course it did not start. That car was just that way. You never knew when it would work or not. The dog-headed demonic creature began scratching the glass of the windshield with its claws, making a terribly painful sound as it did so. My ears were aching at this screeching noise, and I wanted to scream and go insane. I wanted to give up and go crazy, but some aspect of me decided wildly that we would make one final attempt to escape this nightmare. And so I opened my driver's side door and I ran toward the back of the car, past it, and off into complete mystery, as I could see nothing but grayish whiteness before my eyes in any direction that I looked. I ran on squishy, wet ground, and so I knew I was not running into traffic by accident. I decided to avoid the pavement out of fear of getting run over before I even saw a car approaching, but I had no other plan at all. Behind me, I heard the huffing and the puffing of that nightmare dogman creature, which only made my heart beat harder and only made my legs move faster. And then I tripped over something I hadn't seen and toppled face first into the soft, squishy ground. What was that lump in my way? I reached back with my hands and I felt something awful. Waving my hands to clear away some of the intense fog, I saw what I did not want to see. That, in front of me on the ground, was a former human being that I had tripped over. It was now just a mess lying on the ground, however. It was not run over, though. This was no traffic accident. This former person had been the victim of a particularly vicious animal attack, and I could hear the animal itself approaching the one that must have been who inflicted this violence upon him or her. I ran madly, insanely. I no longer cared if I ran into traffic, and when I felt pavement beneath my feet, I just went with it. Soon I saw headlights in the fog, and I tried to wave my arms over my head and flag down the car. I could hear it approaching from the front. I could hear the rasping breathing of the nightmare dogman behind me, and I could hear my own heart beating wildly in my ears. That car did not seem to be slowing down. He didn't see me. I didn't dive out of the way, though, because that car was my last hope. I wasn't going to be able to outrun that wild beast man for much longer. I needed that car to stop for me. At the last second, I heard the squealing of tires. I saw the headlights move to my left, and I knew that I had been seen. I dove to the right to get out of the way as I heard the vehicle hit hard into something behind me and to my left. I rose to my feet, finding my right knee was pretty banged up, and I limped in the direction I had heard the car screech to a halt. Finding the back left door, I tried it and found the door unlocked. I jumped in the car and saw the driver, a guy in his 30s, with tears pouring down his face, staring at me, and I shouted at him to drive. He asked me who I was, and I told him again to drive. He asked me who that guy was that he just hit, and I told him a third time, drive. He said he couldn't drive. He had to go out and see if that guy was all right. I shouted at him no, but he got out and walked forward into the mist, staring down at the pavement and looking for his accident victim. I saw the dogman rise up behind the driver. I saw that dogman grab the guy, his talons sinking in and causing the poor man to scream in utter pain. I knew what was about to happen, the same thing that had happened to the other person I had tripped over, and then I knew what I had to do. Jumping into the front seat, I was relieved that the engine was still idling. I put it in drive, and I drove out of there. I remember laughing and crying as I drove. I remember being certain that I had gone insane, but that there was nothing that could be done about it. I remember the fog eventually lifting, and I remember seeing the sign to turn off to some town, but I don't remember which town. I remember finding the police station, and I remember walking in and telling the officer on duty that I had lost my mind. Most of the next few days are still kind of a blank, as they had some people dope me up pretty heavily for a while. I do remember that I said to them that I either just saw two people get murdered by a monster, or else maybe I committed the crimes myself and only hallucinated the monster part. I told them that wasn't my car I had driven up in, that mine was out on the road. I know I was held at first as the potential killer, then held longer as a mental patient by the county while my family in Canada were contacted. I remember my father driving all the way down to get me, unable to hide his disappointment at what a weak and pathetic failure his son had grown up into. I couldn't really blame him. The killings were ruled animal attacks, which is why I was released into the custody of my family. The police told me they were out looking for the creature, but I told them I was sure they wouldn't find it. They asked me why I was so sure, and I just started laughing and crying all over again. You got me too drugged up now, I told them. I can't feel as bad when I'm this groggy. And then I laughed some more. They thought I was spouting gibberish, but no, I had figured it out. That Dogman came out of the ether and into existence because of how upset I had been. If I was prevented by the sedation from feeling emotions that extreme, then that Dogman would be prevented from entering our reality. It had made its getaway, and the officers were on a wild goose chase if they wanted to look for it. And that was why they never found out who did those killings on the savage night of the Dogman. Dogman of the Corn. Dear Scary Stories NYC, here's a story about something that happened to me when I was a kid that I never had any explanation for until recently. That's because I only recently learned about the Dogman and put two and two together. What I saw was so confusing and terrifying to me that I was afraid to tell anyone about it. I really thought I was losing my mind because of that incident, but now I know it had to have been a Dogman, and I might not be so crazy after all. I'm very excited to tell you what happened because talking about it is a very healing thing for me. It makes me feel like a heavy weight is finally being lifted off my shoulders after so many years. When I was a kid, my father was a salesman who somehow made friends with a guy who worked at IBM. He always told me to be on my best behavior when the IBM guy was around because Dad hoped to eventually get himself a steady job at the same company. Dad was always trying to move up in the world, and so he had to fit in with this super straight guy who wore white business shirts even on Saturdays. This IBM guy seemed to almost be a robot to me compared to the way people acted in Brooklyn where we lived. He never shouted. He never seemed to get upset. He never seemed to get happy. He was just always like half asleep in my opinion. I would do an imitation of him talking like a zombie when we got back home. I even had an imitation of his zombified way of walking. But I knew to wait until we got home to do my comedy routines because I didn't want to blow Dad's chances of staying friends with this guy he wanted to work with. I knew even then that Dad had too much personality and emotion to fit in at that company, at least if the other people there acted like this dude. Maybe they weren't all like that, I don't know. It never did pan out for my father, but we did get to spend 3 or 4 different weekends up in the country at the IBM guy's house. Ironically, he lived in Woodstock, which most of us now associate with hippies and drugs and free love. It was not like that back then, though. I mean, this was after the original Woodstock concert event, but not that long after, and the area was still a mix of farmers and very straight people, as far as I saw on our trips there. I never saw one hippie in Woodstock any of the times we visited. What I did see a lot of was corn. Down the road from the IBM guy's house, there was a cornfield. It was huge, especially to me as a kid. It seemed to stretch on forever, and the corn always seemed to be over my head, no matter what season we were visiting. The last visit was the most memorable of all. It must have been just before harvest time because the corn was ripe and ready to pick. The IBM guy even pulled some ears down right off plants growing next to the road. I asked if that wasn't stealing, but he told me that the harvest was so giant, a few ears of corn wouldn't be missed. We had corn with dinner that night, and it tasted better than any corn I'd had before or have had since. That was my first association of food with the earth. And ironically, it came from that super straight guy who worked on computers. I never really thought about where food came from before. And it was a fully magical thing to realize how a tiny seed stuck in dirt can become food later on. It still amazes me to think about it. So the next morning I got up before everyone else, when it was still mostly dark outside and the sun was only barely beginning to rise in the sky. I was still on an emotional high from eating the corn I saw plucked from the plant the night before, and I decided I wanted corn for breakfast as well. Although I would never have gone out walking around outside at dawn back home in Brooklyn, I felt safe out there in the country. Not only did there not seem to be any crime, there didn't even seem to be any people to commit any crime. So I got dressed and I walked down the dirt road between the super tall corn plants, looking for an ear that was low enough to the ground for me to reach it and pluck it off the corn stalk. I began to smell something worse than dog poo, and I was about to turn back when ahead of me I saw the exact thing I had gone out there looking for. Low-hanging fruit, or, low-hanging vegetables. An ear of corn I was pretty sure I could reach. I took another few steps forward, and man, did it reek over there. I was a kid, though, so I just kept on going. I didn't know what that smell was back then, but if I smelled that now, I would assume that it meant death was nearby. What I mean is, it smelled like something had passed away in the vicinity. I walked over to that ear of corn and I reached up. I was barely able to grab the bottom of it, so I grabbed the stalk itself and tried to pull it back toward me and make the corn lower to the ground and easier to reach. I was shaking that plant. I was shaking the leaves. I was causing some noise and fuss, but I didn't see anybody around, so I didn't see how I could be bothering anyone in the dark pre-dawn hour of the morning. Apparently, though, I was annoying someone very much. A couple or 3 rows of corn back from the dirt road, I sensed a stirring. It started down on my level, then worked its way up over my head. Then I saw the tops of the corn plants shaking as well. More curious than scared, I backed up a few steps to see better. That was when a big, giant, gray dog head pushed its way up out of the corn and looked down at me with a curious expression on its face. It was pretty surprising to see a dog head up over the corn, and I think I was as confused by the dog as it was by me. We stared at each other in wonder for a moment that I'll never forget. Then the dog's demeanor changed, and it showed its teeth to me, growling. I realized I might be in danger, and I got scared, but I still stood there staring at this dog. It barked at me loudly, and I gave up on the corn and ran toward the IBM guy's house. The dog stepped out onto the dirt road behind me to watch me run away, but fortunately, he didn't run after me. As you might have already guessed by now, he was standing on his hind legs. He was a dogman. I got back to the house crying and looked in on my parents, who were both still asleep. I decided I'd get in trouble if I woke them, so I went back to bed to wait for breakfast. I must have fallen asleep because soon my mother was waking me up and scolding me for being so lazy. "Why are you always the last one to get out of bed?" she asked me accusingly. I told her I wasn't the last. I was the first. I was already outside trying to pick corn for breakfast, but the giant man with the dog head scared me back to bed. My father overheard this, and the two of them began discussing me as though I weren't even there. "How old is he going to be before he knows the difference between dreams and reality?" they asked each other. "Do you think he needs professional help?" The more I insisted that I wasn't dreaming, the more embarrassed of me my parents became. For the rest of my childhood and teenage years, my parents never believed me. I would tell them something, they would roll their eyes and ask if I heard that from the dog-headed man in the cornfield. All those years as I grew up, my younger sister would do terrible things and blame me, and my parents always assumed that I was either lying or living in a fantasy world. I really developed a chip on my shoulder. I became the kind of person who collects evidence to prove every point I make. I never expect to be believed, so I'm always working hard to prepare a case to defend myself. It's really shaped who I became as an adult. And yet recently, my son started telling me about the Dogman, and I realized this was what I saw in that cornfield as a child. I'm not suggesting the creature eats corn, although he might. I think he had dragged some prey into that cornfield to have privacy while he ate his kill. I think that explains the bad odor. The Dogman was dining on meat as predators and scavengers do, and I wandered along and interrupted his meal. I think I'm lucky I got out alive after I ran into the Dogman of the corn. Don't go anywhere, we've got another Dogman story in a second, but first, Mark Nash makes a splash, flies by so fast I get whiplash. Mr. Nash has made his mark. He whacked that ball right out of the park. Please join us in thanking our newest channel member, Mark Nash, for making this episode possible. He gets to see our secret Sunday uncensored stories, as well as our almost 20 hours of archived stories, which I'm still working on that new volume of. You can see all this, too. Just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or do what Mark Nash did and click that join link under this, or any of our videos, to become a channel member. PQ River will be along at the very end of this show to provide you with more deets, but now, let's get into our second Dogman story of the episode, and we call this one The Dismal River Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a Nebraska Dogman story for you if you want it. This happened on the banks of the Dismal River, at the part where Blue Star Memorial Highway passes over it. This was way back in the early 1970s, and I had just moved away from my parents. I was feeling free. I don't just mean free from my parents, but also free in a this land was made for you and me way. I drove past that lovely scene of the Dismal River snaking around under the overpass, and I knew that was where I wanted to be. I'm trying to remember, did I take the next exit and drive back around? No, I parked my VW Beetle alongside the highway, I'm pretty sure. I do remember climbing down a hill somewhere to get to the river. Then I just stripped down to my underoos and wandered out into the ice-cold water. It was a hot day, so once I got over the initial shocking coldness, that water was a blessing. I was able to keep cool, and it felt so nice to be there that I didn't want to think about my hike back to the car. Eventually, even a hippie has to come out of the water, though, and I stood by the shore of the river, letting the sun dry me off a bit before I put the rest of my clothes back on. I heard a splashing at a distance and saw something completely unexpected that freaked me out. This got my heart pumping more than the cold water had. I grabbed my clothes and backed away from the water because I saw a monster swimming diagonally across the water. It seemed to have started on my side of the Dismal River, but far off to my right, and was swimming against the current over to the side opposite me. When I say I saw a monster in the river, though, I don't mean a Loch Ness monster or a water creature at all. I mean I saw a big hairy monster swimming across the river. I did not interpret it as a dog swimming. In fact, I didn't really think of it having a dog head at all until it got out of the water on the other side and shook itself off in that way that dogs do. In the water, I had seen a long snouted monster head and long hairy arms and legs kicking the water all over the place as it motored from here to there. It was the scariest thing I ever saw, and it was out there in bright daylight, apparently unconcerned about who else might see it. I've been reading about the Dogman ever since the pandemic. I never really had time to look into it before. I've been learning a lot about the subject, but I noticed almost all of the sightings seem to take place at dusk, night, or dawn. The general presumption seems to be that the creature must be nocturnal. That is, it prefers night to day. Well, I guess I ran into a misfit Dogman because This could not have been a brighter or hotter afternoon, and this thing was right out in the open. Once the creature was on dry land again, it shook itself off while down on all fours like a dog. It was clearly not a dog, though. It was shaped like a mix between a dog and a human. Its proportions were neither those of a canine nor those of a human. Its front legs were really arms, but far longer than your arms or mine. They gave him a reach longer than any boxer in history. The legs were, I guess, really not that much longer than mine, but the torso sure made up for that, so the creature stood much taller than me when standing fully upright. It must have been at least 7 feet tall. I would say that 7 feet was a conservative estimate, to be sure. The ears on the creature were nothing like a man's ears. In fact, they were placed up on top of its head like a dog's ears. Although they looked upright and triangular at certain times, they would flop down or back depending on the creature's personal intent. For instance, when it first saw me, the ears stood up, and it was curious. Once it had decided that it did not care for me, and in fact meant me harm, the ears flattened themselves out and faced themselves backward. I am often asked about the eyes, which looked like canine eyes. I don't remember seeing whites of those eyes. They were very, very dark. It did not exhibit eye shine during this episode at all, but that might be due to the intensely bright sunny day when all of this took place. I had expected to see it standing up on its hind legs and was surprised to watch it initially down on all fours. That's another thing that was backwards in my sighting as opposed to many others. When he eventually stood up on his hind legs, that made more sense to me, not less. Maybe this is because I was witnessing him in the daylight. Maybe this is because I had watched him swimming using an overhand movement with his arms in a human style. This was no doggy paddle that I was witnessing. It was something closer to an Olympic athlete competing in water sports. I kept moving further and further back from the water's edge as I watched the monster, but it hadn't appeared to notice me yet. In fact, it had its back to me most of the time I was viewing it. The dogman seemed about ready to begin walking away from me when, for some reason, it looked over its shoulder in my direction just before departing. Maybe it sensed that I was looking at it in that same way that we can sense when someone is looking at us. Whatever made it turn around, when it did, it caught my eyes with its eyes, and it felt like it locked into me in that instant. I squealed like a stuck pig and ran away in the direction of my car. But before I could even turn to run, I saw and heard that dog-headed monster dive back into the water. It had decided to chase me. I needed to get back to my car faster than that dogman or my story would be over. I remember hearing the cars driving past on the highway, knowing that the monster was going to end my life in view of everyone. It just seemed so insane that those people could be perfectly safe in their cars, watching me get run down and finished off just 100 feet away. Maybe I'm not making sense to you, but when you think you're about to die, then these kinds of thoughts make sense. If I were only on that road, if I were only in a car, then I'd be safe. That's what I was thinking. I remember now I had definitely had parked alongside the highway a bit further north of the river. I remember running along the base of a hill on the side of the highway, not wanting to begin climbing until the last moment in order to keep at maximum speed for as long as I could. There was a small hill covered by scrub and trees that the car was parked to the left of. It wasn't all that steep, as the highway, which had risen into the air to go over the river, was coming back down to ground level at that point. With the dog-headed monster chasing me, it felt to me like I needed to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. I looked behind, and the dogman was no more than 30 feet behind me, running upright and on 2 legs. I got the feeling that if it had been running on all fours, it could have already captured me. As it was, the monster seemed only to be playing. I think he just wanted to chase me until I got too tired to run. and then he would have an easier time finishing me off. He had an understanding that I lacked stamina on his level, and he was quite confident that he had the situation and me fully under his control. When I reached the part of the hill my car was parked next to, I flew up over the embankment, pulling out reserves of strength I did not know I had in me. I never felt so desperate or so frightened before. I knew I had to give every bit of myself to this effort, or there wasn't going to be a tomorrow. I remember scrambling in a sloppy manner, almost slipping back down multiple times, but managing to hold on with the most massive expenditure of my energy that I ever made. As I reached the top of the hill and I got my car keys out, I took a moment to glance back down to see where that dogman was. It was still down the hill. It had not gone up the embankment. It looked like it had no interest in going up onto the highway at all. I no longer had to hurry. It seemed to consider me out of bounds for some reason. I was safe, yet I still did not feel any of that. My hands still shook as I struggled to unlock the passenger side door, which was normally a very simple act. I got in the car, slid over to the driver's seat, and commenced to have just as much trouble starting the engine as I had in opening the door. Once I got it started, though, I put that car in drive, too frightened still to look back and see if the monster had changed its mind, and climbed up to the road after all. I drove away even though my nerves were shattered and I really shouldn't have been driving. I wanted to pull off the road and take some time to calm down, but I needed to get away from the dogman. This event, looking back on it, sort of signaled the end of my free spirit period. I had almost kicked the bucket because I had randomly decided to take a swim in the Dismal River. I became frightened of random decisions, and I became a planner, and a pre-planner, and a replanner. I nearly flipped personalities after becoming traumatized by the dogman. I was never again the same person after I met the Dismal River Dogman. Did Dogman burn down my house? Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you that I unfortunately call my life. It's the sad tale of how my wife, who we can call Jenna, and I saved up for over 40 years so that we could afford a home to retire to in the country. Then, once we had finally achieved our goal, along came a dogman who took less than a year to destroy all our hard work. I'll skip the boring stuff and jump right to the point where all the craziness started. It was about a week after Jenna and I moved into a lovely home off the beaten track in Pennsylvania. We should have gotten something in New Jersey where we had lived for most of our marriage, but this house was so beautiful, plus it was larger and with more land than anything we could find closer to home. It looked enchanted, set deep in the woods with a family graveyard in the back. Yet it had its own road from the highway leading right to our front door. It was fully modern while still maintaining the feel of an old house from the early 20th century. The doors, door frames, and staircase featured original crafted woodwork that made us feel like we were living in a Gothic novel. We really loved that house, but I don't think it loved us. We weren't even there a week before the trouble started. I was out back drinking some suds and my wife was inside cleaning something. She's always cleaning something, she can never just relax. That's why I have to relax twice as much. I'm doing it for both of us. So I was practicing my skill and relaxing the hell out of that evening when I heard a growling sound coming from the tree line in the back of the yard about 30 or 35 feet in front of me. I immediately sprang to my feet because I couldn't see what was there under the dark tree cover, and it sounded like something quite large. At this same moment, I heard my wife scream inside the house. I backed away from where I'd been sitting and moonwalked into the back door of the house, keeping my eye on that tree line, half expecting to see a lion or something jump out at me. When I got inside, it turned out the reason why my wife had shouted in fear was that a coffee cup had flown off the hook it was hanging on and smashed into the wall on the opposite side of the kitchen. She was cleaning up the mess as I came in. I didn't understand what she meant, so I asked her to tell me again what happened. She walked to the hook the cup had hung on and demonstrated for me the arc it had traveled as it left that hook, zoomed across the room, then smashed to little porcelain bits on the opposite wall. I was doubly amazed by this as I told her that simultaneous to her having that experience, I had heard some large animal growling at me from the tree line. Jenna was as confused by what I told her as I had been by what she told me, possibly even more. I made a mental note of both of these events, hoping that they would not repeat themselves. My hopes were dashed when that very night I awakened at a little after 3 a.m. to hear growling. Possibly that same exact growl, coming from right inside our bedroom. I woke my wife up and asked her if she had heard anything strange. She listened for a few seconds, then gasped and sat up in bed. We could hear something large in the room with us, but we couldn't see anything in the darkness. Turning both our bed table lights on, the room was fully illuminated, but we still could see nothing there which could have been making that growling sound. Furthermore, once the light was on, the growling entirely ceased. I began to wonder aloud if something in the house itself was producing a sound that only seemed to be growling. Even as I said it, the theory took on water because the first time I heard it from the woods, not from the direction of the house. Maybe it was an echo? Maybe the sound is somehow being bounced around and seeming to come from places that it was not actually coming from. Jenna seemed satisfied that it had stopped and went back to sleep right away. I found myself too stressed out to get back to sleep until the sun came up the next morning. We had a couple or 3 normal days and we had begun to forget about the weird occurrences when suddenly, my wife Jenna got our first view of the Dogman himself, or itself. While driving home from shopping in a nearby town, Jenna made the turn off of the highway onto the road that leads to our house. She said she felt that something frightening was about to happen just before it did, comparing it to scary music playing in a movie just before the monster jumps out. And jump out is what it did. A tall, hairy, man-shaped creature bounded out of the woods, landing on the road and attempting to block her from driving past it. Jenna has had a deathly fear of exactly this thing happening since the anti-American riots started in 2020. She wakes up screaming from nightmares in which her car is surrounded by slogan-spouting blue-haired upper-class lunatics who drag her out of her seat and beat her because they don't like people who look like us. When she saw the hideous monstrosity bounce out onto the road in front of her, she felt almost as if those dreams had been premonitions. Only instead of violent and evil offspring of the 1% doing her in, it was going to be a ridiculously tall, absurdly hairy monstrosity with the head of some kind of prehistoric golden retriever. I asked her to tell me exactly what she saw, and she said it was an animal with orangey-brown fur over most of its body, with it being sparsest on its chest and belly. It stood much taller than any man she knew, possibly taller than a basketball professional. It had a look of hatred in its eyes, and it seemed to have been waiting for her, at least in her mind. It felt like an ambush, in other words. I asked her what a hairy man with a dog head looked like in general. The legs he stood on, were they like Bigfoot legs? She said no, the creature had devil legs like a goat on which it stood and moved. Its arms were also like devil arms, with clawed hands. I asked her what did she do next, and she told me that instead of stopping as she always had in her nightmares, she floored the gas and spun the car around the monster, barely avoiding crashing into it. She seemed to have taken the creature by surprise, and she saw it glaring at her in her rearview mirror. It did not seem to pursue her at all. While she was telling me about her horrifying experience, we heard a sound coming from the kitchen that I at first mistook for the sound of the stove range lighting up. When I got in there, though, I saw that the water was blasting out of the faucet into the sink. It took quite a bit of strenuous effort to get the water to turn off, but I got it turned off eventually. Once I did, Jenna noticed a similar sound and traced it to the downstairs bathroom. Sure enough, the water was blasting in there as well. I ran upstairs to find not only the sink going at full power, but also the water from the shower head was coming out into the bathtub. None of them turned off very easily. It was like the faucet had been stuck in the fully on position. When we got the situation under control, Jenna had a bit of a panic attack. She felt very cold and shook all over. I hugged her and gave her my body heat to warm her, and all the time she kept muttering that this was all related to the dog-headed monster man that she had seen outside. I also wondered how these things could be happening, and if they were all caused by the same root problem. What my wife had described seeing was so hard for me to visualize or imagine in my mind's eye that I began to wonder if the two of us were cracking up. I got online to find a plumber to inspect the house, but I also searched for someone who could check our property for gas leaks. My idea is that we were sniffing some kind of invisible, odorless hallucinogen, and that we were simply imagining all these strange occurrences. At the time, it seemed the most reasonable explanation. And then, I saw the Dogman myself. Since that evening when I heard the growling outside under the dark cover of the trees, I had been too intimidated to sit in my backyard. There was a room in the back of the house which had been a workshop for one of the previous residents, and I would sit in there instead. I could look out on the backyard I had become too afraid to sit in, and I could watch the sun setting through the window there. It was in that room, through that back window, that I got my first glimpse of the creature that had jumped out in front of my wife on the road. It didn't jump out on me, though. It walked. It walked upright, on its hind legs, just as Jenna had described it doing. I didn't think the legs looked like devil or goat legs, though. I thought they looked like canine or wolf hind legs. Basically similar, but ending in clawed dog feet, not hooves as goat's legs do. The dog-headed prehistoric man was already looking at me sitting behind that window, even as it emerged from the darkness. I thought I was sitting in shadow, but it could see me there, and it gave me all of its attention. The dogman was baring its teeth at me, and I could hear it growling. It might have been the same growling I heard in the yard that previous day. It might have been the growling that the two of us heard in the bedroom. I felt like I was losing my mind when the idea that I should be filming this hit me. If it was real, I should be able to record it on my phone. Then at least I would know it wasn't a hallucination. I ran upstairs to our bedroom where I had left the phone, then ran back down to the room where I saw that monster was no longer out in our backyard. I shouted at Jenna to stay inside, but I ran out back, only to find nothing out of the ordinary. I ran up one side of the house, around the front, then around the other side to the backyard again, but there was no dog-headed caveman anywhere to be seen. I went back inside and had a bit of an emotional breakdown, convinced more than ever that I was losing my mind. Well, the plumber could find nothing wrong with the plumbing, but he didn't let that stop him from charging us an arm and a leg. There were no gas leaks found on the property either. The plumber suggested we should have an electrician come out to see if we had faulty wiring, which might be producing a fear cage effect. I asked him what that meant, and he said he wasn't sure, but he saw it once on a ghost hunting program on TV when he used to have cable. We never did do that. I was too afraid of what that electrician was going to cost. What I did instead was I went out and bought myself some protection. I got a rifle to protect my wife and home with, and I have a story in which that comes into play. I did in fact use it when confronted by the beast. I know YouTube has a ban on talking about defending your own home, so I'll leave that story out for now. I can write it up for you if you have use for it, but typing is not my main talent, so I'm going to leave that story out. Most of the times when one of us would see the Dogman, the other one of us would experience poltergeist-type activity. It didn't happen every time, but it often did. Something would fly across the room, or maybe we might hear footsteps upstairs or downstairs. I consider all the faucets turning on to be poltergeist activity as well, since we never found a better explanation for it. The growling in the bedroom returned one more time, this time accompanied by a sound like something was scratching the ceiling above us. I'll be honest, we began looking into moving at that point, but there was nothing else we could get unless we were able to sell that house first. Consequently, we put it on the market while still living in there. The same real estate person we had bought it from was given the job to try and unload it on someone else. She told us that it took her 7 years before she found us to buy the place, which did not lighten our mood, as you can imagine. I saw a video online about Skinwalker Ranch, and I actually tried to contact Robert Bigelow, but had no success with that at all. A feeling of gloom and doom overtook us as we were sleep-deprived and increasingly afraid to venture outside. Jenna would no longer risk going shopping without me literally riding shotgun alongside her. Our beautiful retirement in the country was fast turning into a horror movie sequel. The Dogman was our main problem, as he was completely intimidating and terrifying. The creature looked like he wanted to tear us limb from limb. It seemed so utterly filled with hate. I think it was partially supernatural in some way, and I think that for a couple of different reasons. First of all, the way it would appear to one of us while ghost activity manifested to the other was not something that happens if you get visited by a bear or a wildcat. Secondly, that growling in our bedroom sounded like the same growling that the creature would make, but we could see nothing there in the bedroom with us. Was the Dogman in fact a ghostly presence? It certainly seemed solid and real when we would see it. My wife did not say she saw a ghost jump out onto the road. She said she saw a tall, two-legged animal. Can something be an animal sometimes, yet invisible or disembodied other times? These are questions I still cannot answer. The night that the incident happened in which I was forced to use that shotgun, both Jenna and I were at the breaking point. I told her I was going to take her to town and we were going to eat at a restaurant and we were going to feel normal for an hour or two. She thought the idea was silly and frivolous and turned down my offer at first. I got ready to go anyway, and when she saw that I was going to drive into town whether she came with me or not, she changed her mind and jumped in the car. The trip into town was uneventful, and it really did feel like a huge relief just to make conversation with the waiter and do normal, ordinary things again instead of horror movie things. By the middle of dinner, Jenna was even starting to laugh again, which was wonderful to see. The wine might have helped a little bit in that regard. We had a real ball, but when we realized it was time to go home again to that property, that haunted land, our moods turned dark all over again. Jenna asked me if we could rent a room somewhere for the night. She was that scared of going home. This made me angry, and I told her that, one way or another, I was gonna make it better. I wasn't sure how I was gonna do it, but I wasn't going to allow my wife to live in fear any longer. She told me that she believed me, but I don't think she really did. And when she doesn't believe in me, then I find it a lot harder to believe in myself. We drove home in a horrible mood, feeling like things were only going to get worse and worse and worse for us. and as we got closer to our turnoff, we both saw something that caused our hearts to sink even further. It was a tall, dark, gray plume of smoke rising up from the woods. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," Jenna began chanting. We both suspected it from the first instant we saw it. That smoke must mean that our house was on fire. As we drove down the road toward the house, we could see that our worst fears were being realized. Our beautiful house in the country, that we worked almost half a century to be able to afford, was engulfed in flames. The entire upstairs was lit up, and only a couple of rooms downstairs hadn't caught fire yet. Jenna called the fire department on her cell phone while I ran inside the house and salvaged some paintings and a family album from the rooms that hadn't caught fire yet. By the next morning, we were the owners of a car, some paintings, and a haunted bit of property that no longer had a house on it. With the help of some of Jenna's relatives, we were able to get ourselves a small apartment in a city in New Jersey. It's not the best neighborhood, that's for sure. It's loud. It's smelly. We don't get along with all of the neighbors. And, it's in the city, so of course there's lots of violent crime. This was exactly what we were hoping to avoid having to deal with in our golden years, but it's not all bad. After all, the one advantage we have here that we did not have in our country home is this: there is no Dogman in the city. The firemen said that the house caught fire due to faulty wiring, so maybe we should have had that electrician out after all. No matter what the experts tell us, though, both Jenna and I are left with one nagging question. Did Dogman burn down our house? We hope you enjoyed that allegedly true story. Our channel members and PayPal subscribers can listen to the little extra story that the narrator refers to in today's secret uncensored scary Dogman story. You can sign up to hear it too by either becoming a PayPal subscriber at peterbernard.com or else by clicking the join link under any of our videos and becoming a channel member. Speaking of which, our newest channel member has a perfect name for this channel, and that name is Wolf Rogers. Our executive producer is Wolf Rogers. Nothing rhymes with Wolf Rogers except the Los Angeles Dodgers and those codgers we took in as lodgers. Please join me in thanking Wolf Rogers for making this episode possible. The Weed Werewolf, or Dog-Headed Man at Mount Shasta. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a 4th of July Dogman story for you that took place, I guess, 4 years ago or 5. It's about a trip I took to look for UFOs that ended up with a terrifying and unexpected Dogman experience instead. Nobody expects the Dogman, not even the Spanish Inquisition. My girlfriend we can call Shasta and I were into our high strangeness and weirdness kick back then. We were inspired by old dog-eared John A. Keel paperbacks we found in a used bookstore, and an interview with Stan Gordon we heard on one podcast or another. Soon, we were collecting weird old books by guys like Frank Edwards and reading any article we could find on the internet about strange places that we could visit. Whenever we could get away from town for 2 or 3 days, we'd either drive or take a train or a bus to haunted locations in the Northeast. If people claimed to have seen a monster in an area, we tried to go there and imagine what it must have felt like that day or that night when the original incident took place. When Shanda's dad started telling us that old songs by the band The Pixies were actually stories about high strangeness cases but worded in code, we sat down with him and let him decode them for us. For instance, the song Valoria is actually about Lemuria and Mount Shasta out in Northern California. We got interested in reading about all the mysteries and legends of Mount Shasta. There were supposed to be very tall Nordic blonde entities that lived in the mountain. It's purported to be the entrance to another world, or possibly a portal to another reality. People see strange things over there, including but not limited to UFOs. If you start to look into the subject, you soon discover that it's another one of those bottomless rabbit holes that the worlds of UFO and monsters are so known for. Shanda's dad got us a present for July 4th that year, plane tickets to California, and reservations at a hotel near the mountain. Well, at least on a map it looked like we'd be close to the mountain. Her dad had never actually been out there. We were excited to go, and we brought binoculars with us. Neither Shasta nor I have any experience or talent at mountain climbing, so our plan was just to hang out and watch the mountain from a distance. What we learned from all our reading was that if you invite the strange into your life, it usually accepts the invitation. Just being near the mountain, we figured, would be enough. Then, the mountain would decide to show us whatever it thought we should see. Some people have faith in the everlasting. We had faith in the weird. Speaking of the weird, our hotel reservations were in a town called Weed, California. They even have a store called the Weed Store, which sells signs and t-shirts reading, "I love weed," or "I'm out of weed." They have coffee mugs reading, "Wake up with weed," hats that say "Weed Police." You get the idea. It's a unique kind of place, and we spent a day and a half just walking around over there. The trouble was, though, we could see Mount Shasta from the town, but we couldn't see it from our hotel room. We found a store that sold us a tent and some camping equipment, and we decided to just go ahead and start walking toward Mount Shasta and look for a place to set up camp for the night. We had no idea where we were going or even where we were, and we had no idea how to set up a tent either. Through some combination of translating the directions from the Chinglish and watching YouTube instructional videos, we got a camp set up for the night. In spite of the fact that we could have gotten ourselves killed due to our utter ignorance of roughing it in nature, our spirits were high, and the rest of us was as well. We hadn't seen any Nordic space aliens, we hadn't seen any UFOs, but then again, we'd never seen any ghosts or monsters ever in all our legend tripping, so I don't think we really expected to see anything that time either. It was just about the fun of being in a place that people attributed magical things to. We were extremely surprised when, all of a sudden, we saw a light flying either out of Shasta or else from past it, and it zoomed over our head, then off past the horizon behind us. I mean, the entire incident lasted maybe 4 or 5 seconds, because this thing was zooming. There was no plane, and there was no satellite that could have gone from horizon to horizon in 5 seconds, and we knew that. It was a humbling experience, and I got chills up and down my body. It frightened me, but it only excited Shanda. She jumped up and down and cheered like she was at a college football game. Do it again, she shouted. That unnerved me more than the light flying overhead so quickly. You should be careful who or what you talk to, in my opinion. I didn't like the idea of her making requests of our hosts when we didn't even know who or what those hosts were. Either they had technology so far beyond us as to be considered magic, or else that light was one of them, in which case it was so far past us in terms of evolution that we must be seen as ants by it in comparison. I didn't want to be stomped on like a bug, and I realized I was no longer comfortable being where we were. We were drawing too much attention to ourselves. I wanted to go back to being anonymous in our hotel room. Of course, I didn't voice any of these concerns out loud, since I didn't want to get mocked by Shanda. Her father had paid for us to have an adventure, not to sit locked inside a hotel room watching bad TV. Shanda talked me into turning the video camera of my phone on, then placing it leaning against a rock and pointing toward the mountain. She wanted to catch another flying light. I did as she asked, but on the phone screen, that mountain looked so much further away than it looked to your eyes. I don't think I had much hard drive space, and it stopped recording after only about 5 or 6 minutes. Nothing had happened. She told me to delete that video and start all over again. While I was fiddling with the phone, trying to figure out how to do what she was asking for. Don't you know, another light flew over, this time coming from the south and going either behind the mountain or inside it. Either way, we never saw it come out the other side. It really looked like it had flown directly inside the mountain itself. Again, Shonda jumped up and down like a cheerleader, while I shivered all over and wanted to get on a plane and go straight home. I really did not feel comfortable there any longer, and I just wanted to get out. This time, I did express my reservations to Shonda. I asked her to stop shouting to the entities, and I asked her to please stop making requests of them. At first, she thought this was hysterically funny. Our first legend trip in which we were finally getting to actually witness high strangeness, and I was complaining about it. This was no longer something from a book written before we were born, by men who died years ago. This was happening to us, in the present moment. And it had gotten too real for me, too fast. I had a terrible feeling of foreboding. I was certain that something even more frightening might be about to happen any second, and I openly asked Shonda if we could get out of there before the other shoe dropped. She couldn't believe I was for real, just as I couldn't believe this situation was for real. She told me I was bumming her out and changing the mood. She also told me that I was being fear-based. She had a point there. If I was gonna be afraid, I was only gonna make it more likely that something scary would actually happen. And that was when we heard the howling. I saw Shonda's smile disappear. I saw the blood drain from her face. She was looking at something off in the distance. I wasn't sure what. Her eyesight was always better than mine, and I hate wearing my glasses. I didn't look where she was staring because I didn't want to know what it was. I wanted it to go away. In a quiet voice, Shonda told me to get inside the tent. I asked why, and she got louder, her voice cracking with fear, and she told me to get inside the damn tent. That was when I turned around, and that was when I saw it. There was a bipedal animal running toward us. It was running like a man, but it was not a man. It was some kind of a dog, but it ran on its hind legs, and it was not in a good mood. The eyes were on fire, as though this werewolf-like creature had just taken the elevator up from hell. It was staring at us. It was tear-assing toward us, and I'm telling you, I felt all my energy drain out of me in that one instant. I was lying on my back staring up at the stars before I realized that my knees had given out on me. Shonda was screaming that I should get inside the tent, but I was in such a state of shock that I couldn't remember what she was talking about. Trained as I was to do what she wanted, I began crawling on all fours toward that tent. I wasn't really awake again until I was inside sitting up, and Shonda was zipping the tent closed. The dog barked outside viciously. The only protection I had was the thin polyester or whatever that cheap tent was made out of. We were being growled and snarled at by a big old brown werewolf sort of thing, and I was sad that this was the way it was all going to end. We lived by the strange, and we were going to die by the strange. I was utterly useless in that moment. I had given up and accepted that we were not going to be in this world for very much longer. It isn't fair, I whined, and Shonda gave me a wake-up slap. She silently ordered me to shut the hell up, and we both sat there listening to that werewolf or dogman circling our tent over and over furiously, barking and howling and snarling like it was out of its mind. I wondered why it hadn't attacked us yet. Surely it could get into the tent if it wanted to, so why didn't it just go ahead and do that? Shonda sat down next to me and gave me a hug. I hugged her back, and I figured that would be the last hug of our entire lives. And then we both noticed it had gone quiet outside. We presumed after a long period of quiet that the creature went away, but neither of us had the nerve to look out there and see until the morning. That day, we went back to our hotel with our tail between our legs and spent the rest of the vacation watching bad TV in our hotel room pretty much. That was how our high strangeness period ended. Not with a bang, but with a howl. Thanks to the Weed Werewolf, or the Dog-Headed Man of Mount Shasta. Don't go anywhere, we've got another 4th of July Dogman story in a second. But first, I'ma bust this rhyme. If you wanna have good lucker, get an executive producer like James Tucker. He's always cool and never lame. He's our EP Name James. Please join us in thanking James Tucker for making this episode possible. In return, we share with James our secret uncensored scary stories, as well as our archived scary stories. We've got over 15 hours of those. You can see them too. Just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or else click the join link under this or any of our videos to become a channel member. Dr. Death will provide more deets at the very end of this show, but now let's jump into our second 4th of July Dogman story of the day. Before we launch into this next story, I suppose I should issue a trigger warning for the easily offended. This story was sent in by someone who wears their heart on their sleeve. I decided to leave their opinions in rather than censor them because, this is the 4th of July episode after all. Besides, once they're done ranting in the beginning, it's a pretty creepy and unique Dogman encounter that they're describing. So, if you aren't comfortable with people expressing their independent opinions, you should probably just skip to the next video, or at least skip the first minute or two of this one. That's because this dad likes to share his feelings. In our next tale, submitted from South Dakota of all places, which we call the July 4th Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a story from back in 2018 of patriotism, faith in America, and the Dogman in South Dakota. That's right, South Dakota. Not usually known as a hotbed of cryptid activity, but nonetheless, that was where our family made our sighting. And we made it around 1 a.m. on the night of July 3rd. In other words, the morning of July 4th. My family and I had been planning a trip this year to Mount Rushmore to see the July 4th fireworks there for the first time since before the pandemic. Our favorite president is Teddy Roosevelt because we are progressives, and he founded the Progressive Party. He also created the first national parks in our country, and he was a good friend of Booker T. Washington. He appointed the first black and female regional postmaster in the United States, and he spoke out for equality between all races at a time when that could get you canceled or worse. To say he was a brave man would be an understatement. To say he was a great American would be overly obvious. When my family found out that this current failure of a federal government had canceled this year's fireworks show in San Diego, we were disgusted. We plan on finding another progressive and enlightened way to celebrate the proudest day in human history, the anniversary of the signing of the document which declares us all free. Possibly we'll build a bonfire to throw our lying television set and propaganda newspapers into. I'm sure Roosevelt would have approved. But let me push righteous indignation to the side so I can tell you a little cryptid story. The only cryptid story my family can tell. We've never seen a Bigfoot. We've never seen aliens, and we've never been to Loch Ness, but we did see an actual dog-headed hairy beast man in the Black Hills National Forest. We had spent the day of July 3rd in the Cosmos Mystery area, just a little ways away from Mount Rushmore. If you're into weird stuff, you could do worse than stop here. It's great for the kids as well as the parents or guardians. We were camping at the Holy Smoke Campground, which is 10 minutes away by car from the mystery area. We walked along the highways to get there, which was quite hectic, especially with 3 kids. When we got there, we were told there were trails we could walk to get home, but nobody told us how long that way would take. It's supposedly a 3-hour walk, but the day was hot, and none of us were used to hiking, so we gave up and went off trail midway, hoping that GPS could guide us as we cut through nature to try to get back to our rented cabin and get some shut-eye before July 4th was here. We didn't get home until around midnight, but we were all so famished that we found ourselves outside barbecuing in the middle of the night. That was the only kind of food we brought with us. This year we were also going to bring trail mix, but as I said, there isn't going to be any patriotic celebration on July 4th this year, at least not at Mount Rushmore. Maybe they'll have a celebration in China instead. At any rate, after some food, the kids all crashed inside, and it was me and the missus sitting there outside having a smoke and a drink and unwinding. From off in the distance, I saw something very weird moving toward us. It looked like a cosplayer, to be honest, which is why it raised my hair on end. It was not something that should have been walking around in the Black Hills National Forest at 1 in the morning. That was for sure. So my first thought was that this must be some sicko, and my alarm bells went off. I pointed it out to my wife, and she got up and went right inside. Our barbecue was still going, so I poured my wine on it to put it out, and I got ready to join my family inside. I wanted to get a better look at that creep, though, first. I wanted to see exactly what kind of threat our family was being faced with. It felt like I was in a 1980s stalker slasher picture, to be honest. I figured that was someone in a costume that chopped up families in various grisly fashions, like Freddy Krueger in a bear suit. But then, the figure stood in a better lit area, and I could see that was not a human at all. It was too tall to be a human, and its legs were all wrong. It was a dogman, that's what it was. An upright walking canid, like they talk about on the internet. Its long pointed ears on top of its head were twitching, and had a long tail, not unlike that of a German shepherd behind it, and that seemed to be swatting the insects away from its behind. In fact, it looked an awful lot like a German shepherd, with more muscular than usual legs and glowing white eyeshine. It was a dogman. There was nothing else it could have been. But what was it doing in South Dakota? The creature stopped when it noticed me noticing it. It just stood there and stared. Suddenly the situation made more sense to me. It must have smelled our barbecue, and that was what had attracted it. The fact that it stopped approaching when it saw that it had been spotted gave me a sudden influx of courage. It must not want to interact with humans. It must just be hungry. I stood as tall as I could, and with the deepest voice I could manage, I swung my arms over my head and I started shouting, "Scat! Go away! Get out of here!" I kept walking toward it as I did so, hoping against hope that the creature wasn't looking for a fight. A guy came out of his cabin telling me to shut up, but I just nodded in the direction of the dogman, and he said something I can't repeat here. Then he joined me, and we both shouted at that dog, picking up rocks and throwing them in the beast's general direction as we told it to go away. Then, finally, it turned around and just left. It didn't run away. It just sort of walked, looking kind of disappointed that it wasn't going to get any midnight barbecue. I thanked the stranger for his help, and I finally got to lay down and have some sleep. We all slept in the next morning, getting up in the afternoon, but we made it in plenty of time for that glorious fireworks show. It was always the most moving of all fireworks displays to me. It always made me so happy to be living in the land of the free and the home of the brave. I suppose there can be no bigger wake-up call that bravery and freedom are over than the cancellation of that wonderful event. And so all my wife and I are left with, really, is our memory of the 4th of July, Dogman. Dogman. At the fair. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a story for you about the strangest summer night I ever lived through. It was also the night when my brother Sam and I came face to snout with a dogman. Or a werewolf. I'm really not quite sure even now. This all happened when I was 16 and my brother was 17, way back in 1977. Those of you who actually know arithmetic can figure out how old I am from that information. I lived in a place called Yonkers, which is a suburban sort of area just north of New York City. That particular summer, the neighborhood had been hit by a rash of house pet disappearances. Before too long, most families who hadn't yet lost their cats and dogs started bringing their pets inside and keeping them locked in. No more dog houses, no more guard dogs, no more cats let out for a stroll around the block. But this was just a few days into the whole thing, and the animals were still being disappeared. There never was an official reason that any of that happened, but Sam and I thought that we stumbled upon the answer. It's just that it was an answer that we knew adults would not believe, and that we knew would probably get us in trouble. That's because the answer had to do with something that appeared to be a real-life werewolf. My family lived near Untermeyer Park, and that place is a favorite of ghost hunters even to this current day. When the story took place, it was a hangout of teenagers like me and my brother who wanted to see a ghost. It looked like it was designed by Barnabas Collins, and you really got the sense that you were walking into the past when you snuck in there after dark. We both had friends who told us about seeing ghosts in there, but my brother and I were both still waiting for our first taste of the paranormal. Well, we got it, but it wasn't a ghost that we ended up seeing. There are various castle-like constructions in Untermeyer, and there are spooky patches of trees. In those trees, there were supposed to be Satanists or witches doing sacrifices. In fact, David Berkowitz, who people call the son of Sam, used to be part of a cult that hung around in Untermeyer Park. When it was all first happening, they always described 2 people involved in those killings, and Berkowitz was only one of them. They never caught the main guy, but that information was suppressed at the time because they wanted to calm the public down. Berkowitz has spoken about this in more recent years, but only once that guy passed away. In our opinion, even the cops were afraid of the actual son of Sam. He would write poetry and send it to the newspapers to publish. He was a smart guy. Berkowitz is not a poet. A lot of us regarded ourselves as poets and artists back in the 70s, and we regarded ourselves as dangerous too. But my brother and I never hurt a fly. We just liked to be nearby danger. And in those days, Untermeyer was dangerous in a lot of different ways. So one night we hung out and not much happened, but our friends were telling us stories of things they had seen earlier in the week. According to this one friend, they heard chanting coming from the woods 2 nights earlier, and when they heard that, they just split. On another recent night, they claimed that they heard a wolf howling. I laughed and said it was probably just a stray dog. I would eat my words before that night was through. Speaking of which, Sam broke off from the others because it was time to bring me home. Before we left, though, the bunch of us made plans to meet up the next night, not at Untermeyer, but at the traveling fair that was only in town for 2 more days. Then, Sam and I began the long, lonely, scary walk through the darkness and trees and castle-looking things, back out into the 1970s version of the Yonkers night. We always did that walk silently, which was a wise thing to do in Untermeyer. And on that night, we heard a slurping sort of a sound coming from inside the bushes. Back then, we thought of ourselves as New Yorkers. To us, Staten Island was New Jersey, but everything from Lower Manhattan up through the Bronx, Riverdale, New Rochelle, and Yonkers, that to us was New York City. In actuality, the city ends when you go north of the Bronx, But in our lives back then, we felt like a northern borough. And in the 1970s, living in New York City meant expecting the worst. You expected crime. You expected danger. You expected sudden violence. You learned to look all around yourself at all times and notice everything. But you also knew to deny that you ever saw anything. You did not stand up to criminals in those days except in the movies. In real life, you were friendly to them and tried to act nonchalant, no matter what you just saw them doing. So when Sam and I heard that slurping sound, we put on our we're not nervous act, and we started trying to look all around without turning our heads too far in any direction. You wanted to look like you didn't care what was happening, while you figured out what was happening and how dangerous it actually was. So when we passed a space between two bushes where we could see what was making that noise, we got ourselves as good a look as we could without slowing our walk or turning too far in that direction. And what we saw was something more shocking than anything we'd laid eyes on up to that point. There was something eating something else in those bushes. He was slobbering over whatever it was, and whatever it was messy. The figure was shaped like a man. He seemed to be wearing a dark outfit, and the man in dark clothing was squatting and holding what it was eating in his hands. So far, nothing too out of the ordinary for that place in that time. Maybe an escaped mental patient. Maybe a kid who got too drugged out. As I took my next step, I saw the head of this dude, and that changed everything. It was not a man. It had a dog head. It had a man's body, but a dog's head. And that dark outfit, I think it was fur, not clothing. And the most memorable thing of all was that the dog had a big ring piercing in his nose, not on either side, but in the center like a bull from an old Popeye cartoon, you know? I broke all the rules and I slowed down. I was probably about to stop and stare. I was that surprised to see a dog-headed man, even in Untermeyer. Before I stopped, though, my big brother casually wrapped his long arm around my shoulder, and we casually walked away, as though we hadn't seen anything. I don't think the creature noticed us, or else it just didn't care, because it kept slobbering in those bushes, and we kept calmly walking away. We didn't talk about it until we got home because we needed to stay alert when walking around at night outside there too. No place was safe in New York back then, not even the suburbs. I guess it's getting like that all over again now, so unfortunately, you may know what I'm talking about. When we got home, it was too late to call our friends. These were the days before cell phones, but we were dying to tell them about what happened. We most definitely were looking forward to going to the traveling fair the next night, not just for the rides and the cotton candy and all that, but also to spread the news of our momentous sighting of, what exactly had we seen? We saw what's been kidnapping and eating the local pets. That's what we saw, Sam suggested. He was my older brother, so when he made a suggestion, I reacted to his idea like it had been written in stone by the Almighty. It was fact. It was received wisdom. It's amazing how big a difference 1 year in age can be when you grow up together. We were the first family to stop letting our cat out. It was because Sam and I begged our parents over breakfast to change the protocol. What if a coyote has gotten into the neighborhood, we asked. Maybe it's just passing through. Maybe we won't have to keep Martha inside for more than a week or two. Thanks to our whining and our pleading, that cat got to live into old age. That day was all about me wishing time would pass faster so that we could head out to the fair that night. Our dad drove us up there and asked us what time he should come pick us up. Sam told him that we were going to get a lift home from one of our friends, and Dad grumbled, but he agreed. When we got inside, this girl we can call Darlene was there, who my brother was always on the verge of dating, and she had brought her cousin we can call Charlene. The cousin was from down south somewhere, and she was closer to my age, so the two of us immediately started making fun of each other and teasing. I discovered that I stuttered when I talked to her, so she imitated me stuttering, and then I imitated how she would play with her hair when she talked to me. You know, kid stuff. I was too nervous to talk about the dogman with the ring in his nose in front of the girls, but Sam wasn't, and he gathered all our Untermeyer friends around and told them the tale like I told it to you. Every so often he would nudge me and say, "Right?" and I would nod and say, "Right." The girls were impressed with the story, and my heart was beating hard. And then, in 2 seconds, I completely ceased caring if the girls were interested in our story or not. My heart started beating even faster, but it wasn't because of puppy love. It was because of dog-headed hate. I looked past Charlene at the carousel we were standing in front of. The carousel operator looked like a really creepy, really sleazy guy, wearing a stained wife beater and with greasy-looking long straight black hair. And a nose ring in the center of his nose, like a bull from a Popeye cartoon would wear. This guy seemed really interested in Sam's story, too. In fact, he seemed a little too interested. I nudged Sam hard and said, "This story's a joke, he's just kidding." Sam got angry at me, but I told him, "Stop joking around, Sam. After all, there's no such thing as what he's describing, right?" I put my back to the nose ring guy and tried to signal Sam with my eyes to look over at that dude. Sam was cursing at me and insisting the story was true, but he did a double take, looking at the guy, realizing he was looking at the same nose ring from the night before, and I saw Sam's jaw drop open. That's when it became my turn to put my arm around his shoulders and lead him away from the carousel. The girls and our friends followed, asking us what was going on and why we were acting so strange. I asked them quietly if the guy was following us, and they asked what guy. I turned around, and the carousel operator with the nose ring was gone. A completely different creepy-looking sleazy guy was running it instead. I got a shiver through me, and I told Sam that I wanted to go home. He explained the story to everyone, but they thought this was all part of some gag, so they weren't buying it. We were talking about a guy with a nose ring like a bull. Back then, very few guys had any kind of piercing, and even fewer had nose piercings. It just wasn't as common as it is now. Our friends felt that they would have remembered seeing a guy like that, so they accused us of making it all up for attention or whatever. Sam insisted it was real and asked our friend with his parents' car to please drive us home. He said no, he'd drop us off at home when the night was over and not before. We lived a good half-hour walk away from there, so I told Sam, "Why don't we just walk home?" He nixed that idea, saying that if we walked alone on that night, we'd be placing ourselves in a spot where the creature could pick us off even more easily, just as if we were one of the local cats or dogs. I saw a big banner up that announced the dates that the fair was going to be there. Suddenly I had a realization, and I pointed it out to the others. The first night that the fair was in town, wasn't that the same night that the first dog went missing in our neighborhood? So what? I was asked. So that was also the night that the nose ring guy arrived here. I was laughed at. The nose ring guy that only you and Sam can see, you mean? They mocked me. The guys weren't buying it. But Darlene and Charlene were kind of getting freaked out. Darlene said, "My brother and I don't lie." And Charlene said she believed our story. They asked for the night to end and for us all to get a ride home, but they were denied just as we had been. Sam said we had no choice but to stick together with the others since there's safety in numbers. Charlene said, "Well, if there's safety in numbers, why don't the four of us walk together home to your house?" Four meaning Me, Sam, Darlene, and Charlene. "Why don't we walk to our house?" said Sam. "Maybe because you don't live at our house, you live a half hour past it, and I'm not going to let you two girls walk home in the darkness with a dog-headed monster man on the loose." Darlene said she was sure that our father would give them a lift home, and that did make sense to me and Sam, so we left the carnival and began the long walk home on mostly pretty empty streets. On that night, I actually felt relieved to walk on blocks where the drug dealers were out. They were unlikely to hurt us. They might be killing off a future customer after all. Staggering drunks asking us for a dime were suddenly a welcome sight considering the alternative. Inevitably, we got to this one block that was scary even in the daylight. There were 2 empty lots overgrown with trees and 2 houses that we called haunted, even though they were actually just run down. You knew as a kid not to ring the doorbells of those homes on Halloween. When we were young, we felt it was because the people who lived inside were evil witches and warlocks, but as we got older, it dawned on us that they were just too poor to afford to buy any candy to give away to the nasty little rich kids in the neighborhood. As we were walking down this block, we kept on the side of the sidewalk closer to the street. One of the streetlights on the other side worked, but all the streetlights on our side were out. So why didn't we walk on that side of the street? Because that side had no houses on it at all. It was just one big long rat's nest. I warned Charlene that I'd seen rats run out of the lots on both sides of the street looking for garbage to eat. The girls did not want to hear that, so I tried to calm them down. "If they run under your feet or up your leg," I told them, "don't freak out. They're just blind and they can't tell too well where they're going." For some reason, that didn't make the girls feel any better about anything. Sam found a wooden plank in the garbage that was strewn around everywhere, and he decided to carry it with him. We were all so scared. Kids today will never know that feeling because they can just pull out their cell phones and have their parents or somebody come pick them up. We could see the light at the end of the tunnel, or in this case, the end of the block. We had nearly finished our walk of doom, and the next block was better populated and better lit. And then the dogman jumped my brother. It happened that fast. He had been waiting for us behind part of a mostly broken down brick wall the entire time we were walking toward him. He was on top of my brother, and Sam was flat on his back on the sidewalk. The wooden plank he had been carrying as a weapon was thrown out in the street by accident when he was attacked. Darlene was out on the street too, screaming her head off. Charlene was not in my view as I ran to get that wooden plank. I grabbed it off the ground and turned around, only to see Charlene holding a broken old TV set over her head, getting ready to drop it on the back of that hairy dog-headed monster man. Now, I don't mean she had a large screen color TV in her hands. I mean one of those old portable black and white TVs. Not flat screen, tube screen, 1970s style. Charlene was a small young woman, and this TV was about the heaviest thing that she knew that she could pick up, so that's what she did. And she heaved it at the dogman, scoring a hit on her first try, which only got the creature even angrier. It stood upright, and we could see for the first time it was as tall as my father, or taller. This was not an 8 or 9 foot tall dogman like people talk about these days. It was maybe 6 feet. It was the nose ring guy. I mean, it had to be. It had the same nose ring as the guy back at the carnival had in his nose. Who else could it have been? The creature was about to grab Charlene, so I let loose with a big whack, swinging that wooden plank as hard as I could into the back of his head. He ignored me and took another step toward our brave young Charlene. Now she was screaming as loudly as her cousin Darlene. And then a Louisville Slugger baseball bat came down with a crack on the back of the skull of that werewolf, and its knees involuntarily gave way. He fell face first on the sidewalk, twitching all over, because that bat must have hit a nerve. "Get in the car," shouted my father. I stood there confused for a second. "Get in the car now before he gets back up." How was my father and his Louisville slugger there on the street standing next to me? Dad put his arm around my shoulders and rushed me out into the street where the car was parked. Once we were all inside, he screeched a high-speed U-turn that left tire marks on the street for the rats to race and play over the next day. What had happened was that my father did not trust our friends to drive us home, and he expected something stupid or bad to happen. Plus, he just had a deep dislike of carnies and didn't feel it was safe to let us go to the fair alone. So he decided to drive on down to the carnival and check up on us. When he saw Darlene standing in the middle of the street screaming, he got there quick with the baseball bat that he always kept in his back seat. Dad thought the dogman or werewolf was a freak that lived on that block. He kept talking about that freak. "Don't you go walking on the block where that freak lives again, you hear me?" "Yes, Dad." "Not even during the daytime, you understand?" "Okay, Dad." Hadn't he noticed that it was a creature covered in fur? Hadn't he noticed that it had a long dog snout with fangs? I mean, granted, it was dark out, but it wasn't that dark. You know, parents are weird. They don't make sense. I know this because my daughter thinks I'm as weird as I thought my parents were. We drove the girls home first, and Dad told us to be gentlemen and walk them to the door. We did that, and right in front of my father, that southern girl gave me a kiss and a wink. I blushed pretty hard. My face felt warmer than if I had a sunburn. I expected to get shouted at about it, but Dad actually sounded impressed with me. He kidded me about it for the rest of his life pretty much, but in that moment, that night, he was briefly proud of his younger son. So in a couple of days, the fair left town. Sam, the girls, and I knew that the threat to the neighborhood pets as well as to us was over. We never explained that to any of the adults, though, so everyone around there kept their cats and dogs inside 24/7 from then on, as far as I can remember. None of the grown-ups ever learned that the danger was directly the cause of the Dogman at the fair. Nancy Sears, she's real gear, makes us grin from ear to ear. No one's better than our dear Nancy under any circumstance. Please join us in thanking today's executive producer, Nancy Sears, for making this episode possible. In return, we share with her our secret uncensored stories, far too wild to ever run on this channel. In addition, Nancy gets to check out our 21 hours of archived uncensored videos, and so can you. Just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or click the join button under this or any of our videos to become a channel member. I saw Dogman chased by a UFO. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I needed to go from Oregon to Montana way back in the 1980s when I was still a young man. So I rented a car and I picked out what looked like the most scenic route, passing by and through various beautiful natural areas that still exist to this day in Idaho. At one point, I was driving along State Highway 75 in Clayton, Idaho, and that is where the most incredible thing I ever lived through happened to me. That is where I saw a UFO chase what I now refer to as a Dogman. I was driving on the part of Highway 75 where it runs right next to the Salmon River. It goes next to it, over it, back and forth, but in this area in or around Clayton, the river generally is on the left of the highway. Sometimes it's further away, and sometimes it butts right up against the side of the road pretty much. I was at a point where the river was maybe 30 to 50 feet from the road when I thought I saw a Bigfoot drinking from the flowing water. It was nighttime, but it was still early in the evening. The sun was almost completely set, but there was still enough ambient light that I could very clearly make out a figure over there by the water, bent down and apparently drinking. It appeared to be a very, very large hairy man, and in the 1980s, especially to a guy like me who grew up in Northern California, that could mean only one thing: Bigfoot. As I watched, the furry figure stood up and looked up in the sky, and I could see that it was a very strange-looking Bigfoot, if it was even a Sasquatch at all. It had a wolf or dog-like head, and it had a tail like a wolf or a fox too. I thought the legs it stood on were like those of a horse, the hind legs of a four-legged animal, in other words. I had no idea what I was seeing, as I had never heard of a dogman at that time. I only knew about Bigfoot. I did not know about dog-headed upright walking or bipedal creatures in those days. I slowed the car down to get a better look, when an even more incredible thing happened. A light came down from the sky, lighting up the dogman in, I guess, around a 10-foot radius around him. It was sort of a cone of light. I leaned my head out my open driver's side window and I looked up, and that's when I saw what the creature had been looking up in the sky at. There was something that looked like some kind of science fiction flying craft up there, and that was where the light was originating from. Oddly enough, my first thought was not that I was seeing a UFO. My thinking was more along the lines of wondering if that thing in the sky was military or commercial. I had never really believed in UFOs or flying saucers, and I thought they were the stuff of fairy tales. This craft appeared metallic and very solid, but when I realized I could hear no sound coming from it, I got scared, and I figured I'd better get back to driving before that circular craft noticed me. It was a flying saucer, I suppose, in that it was basically disc-shaped, but it was not simple as most of the flying saucers I had seen in the Weekly World News or on TV looked. This did not look like a hubcap tossed in the air. It looked very detailed and very real. It had a series of what appeared to be windows that had blue light emanating from them, but they may have been a series of blue lights, since I was not seeing little green men or any other kinds of beings running around inside the flying vehicle. It might have been what we now call a drone, for all I know. I could only tell you what I saw, and I saw it staying perfectly still in the air, completely still, making no sound whatsoever. So I put the car back into gear, but before I could turn the wheel and hit that gas and drive away from that scene, the dog-headed hairy man took off running. He ran onto the highway in front of me, exactly where I was going to go, the direction I needed to go in. I could see as it did so that the creature had canine feet, not horse's hooves as I had for some reason first assumed. It ran as fast as a horse, though, and almost immediately the flying saucer, or whatever it was, took off after the creature, getting him or her back into its beam of light. I was too curious to do anything but let them get a head start, then slowly follow them, trying to keep enough of a distance between me and them that I would hopefully not attract the attention of either one. Before you ask me if I got any photos of this bizarre event, no, I did not. This was back in the day when only rich people or cops had phones in their cars, and those phones did not take pictures. I was kicking myself that I did not bring a camera or my VHS video camcorder with me, but I was planning on driving, and you couldn't really drive and shoot video with those big old clunky recorders we had back in those days. As I said, I was kicking myself, but I really don't know what would have come out on film or video anyway. The night was darkening, and the light from the flying object was blindingly bright, or almost blinding. If I had a chance to change one thing in my life, I would go back in time and tell myself to bring a camera and to keep it on the passenger seat ready to use. And also not to marry my first wife. Well, okay, if I could change two things, one of them would be to have brought a camera on that trip. As we progressed eastward, I noticed there was no other traffic on the road in either direction. It was just me, the Dogman, and the UFO. Sometimes the Monster Man would get out from under the intense light beam, and then the saucer would compensate and shine the light back down on top of him. The Dogman was generally running to the left of the highway, as I think he could make better time running on dirt. But when the river would come too close to the highway, he was forced to run on the asphalt right in front of me. Even when the two of them moved to the left of the road, I did not have the nerve to try to pass them, as I would still have had to have passed very close to underneath that UFO. I had seen the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I knew not to get underneath a UFO. They're known to stop your engine from working. Also, the last thing I wanted was for it to grow bored of the monster and to become interested in me, so I continued to let them lead the way as we drove along. I have to say I was pretty scared through all of this, and part of me wanted to drive away, but a bigger part of me felt both overwhelmed and curious. I wanted to see what would happen on the one hand, and the technology of that UFO was so far advanced that I knew if I turned my car around and drove in the other direction, I wouldn't be any safer from that thing than I was trailing along after it. If they or it wanted to do something to me or my car, they or it could change course on a whim, and I would have no power to stop them, you know? This may be the only Dogman story in history which features something even more terrifying than the Dogman, and that would be that UFO or whatever was in command of it. Somehow I wasn't picturing the noble Captain Kirk inside there either. Both the monster and the aircraft felt evil, but different kinds of evil. For all I know, the UFO was who put that Dogman on Earth in the first place. That's just me guessing, by the way. I'm not saying that's what I believe. The only thing I believe about any of this is that I know nothing at all. Absolutely nothing. I was watching one mystery chase another one, and my mind was as wide open as my eyes and my mouth were. So we drove, and after a while, instead of mountains with their tops in the clouds and pure nature all around, I started to see a house here and a store there. I passed a gas station on the right, and by that point I was thinking, someone else must be seeing this. I can't be the only one seeing this spectacle. But I didn't see anyone running outside to gawk, and I wasn't sure after a while if it even was happening to anyone but me. I know that might sound paranoid, but that's what I was thinking. Maybe I'm the only one seeing this. Me and the Dogman, that is. A little past that gas station, tree-covered mountains rose up on the right of the highway. That was when the creature ran right across the road, off onto the ground to the right, and then began running toward those very tall hills. Soon, he was racing and climbing uphill in a desperate attempt to escape the UFO and its blinding cone of light. I stopped the car and watched as both the Dogman and the UFO disappeared over the mountain, and things got dark again. I felt both a sense of relief that it was finally over, and also a sense of loss, that I would never know what happened in the end. I knew I should just resume driving, but I felt such a strong urge to talk to someone that I drove back to the gas station to see if they were open. They were, and I bought some gas even though I really didn't need to just yet, just so that I could make small talk with the proprietor. After we gabbed for a while, I asked him if he had seen anything strange outside that night. I tried not to get too specific because I didn't want to lead him on. He looked me straight in the eye and asked, "Do you mean the UFO?" And I flipped out, talking fast, asking him if he'd ever seen anything like that before. He just chuckled, and he said, "I haven't seen any UFO at all tonight." I felt really embarrassed. I guess he was just joking, and now he probably thought I was a lunatic. But he let me off the hook and said he wasn't joking, he was just guessing. He told me that he'd seen so many strange things in the skies of Idaho dating back to his young childhood that when he saw the look on my face as I pulled into his station, he already knew I'd seen a UFO. Someone without a state license plates isn't going to be expecting to see the kinds of things that fly around overhead around here, he explained. He told me the UFOs like water, and they appear over it a lot. So in this case, it was probably the Salmon River that drew it. I thought about telling him about the dog-headed man, but it just sounded so preposterous in my head that I chickened out, and I let him tell me what he knew instead. The guy went on and on about UFOs, telling me there's a round lake in the Dogman Chased National Forest just a few miles away that people have seen UFOs hovering over for years. They hover over the lake to take on water. They just suck it right up into the saucer itself. Maybe they need water to stay in the air, he guessed. Or, if they're manned crafts, maybe the crew needs the water. One way or another, he informed me, that part of Idaho is a good place to go if you want to see strange things flying around in the sky. Feeling thoroughly creeped out, the last thing I wanted to do was go back on that darkened highway and drive through the night all alone. Nevertheless, that was what I did, because it wasn't like I could sleep in the gas station bathroom, right? My brain was broken after what I'd seen. It wasn't until 10 or 15 years later that I first read about the Dogman, and believe me, when I did, that filled in a lot of blanks for me. But back then, I was almost as scared of the fact that I didn't know what I saw as I was by what I saw. Do you know what I mean? Suffice to say, that was one freaky night for me, and I did not enjoy myself one single bit until the sun came up and I found myself a motel to sleep a few hours in. And that's the true story of the time that I saw Dogman chased by a UFO. Don't go anywhere, we've got one more short Dogman story in a second. But first, at ball games they eat new franks. In movies they shoot new blanks. But we here like to give thanks for Stephen Eubanks. Please join us in thanking today's executive producer, Stephen Eubanks, for making this episode possible. Stephen gets to see our secret uncensored Sunday stories, far too wild for this channel. He also gets to see our 21 hours of archived uncensored stories too. And so can you. Just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or click that join link under this or any of our videos and become a channel member. Henry Lee Dogman will be along at the end of this episode to fill in any parts I may have left out. But now, let's jump into that second Dogman story I promised you. And we call this one The Smoke Hole Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I seen a Dogman once when I was a teenager, like 18 years old I guess, back in the early 1990s. My parents seen it too, but I'm no longer in communication with them, so I can't get them to back me up on this story. You're just gonna have to take my word for it, I guess. I got to thinking about it recently when I was binge watching a bunch of your shows, and on a couple of them you mentioned that a lot of strange things happen along the ridgelines and the valleys up in Pennsylvania. I looked at Google satellite maps, and I saw that those ridgelines go south into West Virginia, and it was, in fact, right along one of those same ridgelines that I saw the Dogman, or I should say my family and I saw it. I don't see how that could possibly be a coincidence. I think there has to be something to that. Now, there is a cave over by Hopeville Gap and Shroud Ridge in West Virginia called the Smoke Hole Caverns. I personally think that somehow plays into this, as it is my theory that Dogman travels and spends most of his life underground. I think they have a better knowledge of cave systems than we do, and I think that's why it's so rare to see them walking around up here. It's also why I think they're so hard to find when you go looking for them. Anyway, that's just my theory, and it started on that night that we were driving on the other side of the ridge near Smoke Hole Caverns. You see, it was nighttime on a Sunday, and we were driving home after visiting with my uncle and his kids, who used to live down by Onego in those days. If you take the North Fork Highway up out of there, you eventually reach a fork in the road, and we took that fork left to Jordan Run Road, which is County Route 28. On your left, the land drops down, and there's a little bit of fencing there to warn you about that. But on your right is a tall hill. Over on the other side of that hill is the famous Smoke Hole Cavern system that I've been going on about. Well, we were driving along, or my father was, and I was in the back seat just watching the night out of the windows. Suddenly my father started cursing a blue streak, which he almost never did in front of my mother, so I knew something was wrong. He slammed on the brakes, and we all held on for dear life as we screeched to a halt. When I looked out of that front window, I seen a big man covered in sort of tan fur. Just the biggest, scariest caveman-looking guy. And I swear to you, he had a head, kind of like a coyote, but larger, and with nasty-looking teeth coming out of his mouth. He slid down that dirty hill, almost losing his balance and landing on the road. When my daddy finally stopped the car, he was maybe only 10 feet in front of us. He bent forward, acting all threatening-like, and he kinda barked or yelled at us. I would say halfway between a bark and a shout. He was telling us not to come any closer, you know. And believe me, we didn't. So then when he was satisfied that we were staying put, that dogman just turned and jumped over that little metal fencing they got over there on the left, and he went back to slipping and sliding down the hill to wherever he was going to. We sat there for a minute just in a state of shock. Then my mother started yelling at Daddy to get us out of there before that nasty-looking, upright-walking monster dog thing came back up. That's about all there is to that story, but I tell you, that thing was coming from the direction of Smoke Hole Caverns, and I think that has to have something to do with this story. I'm not saying he uses the tourist entrance or anything, but I bet the dogman knows ways into and out of the caves under our feet that none of us have ever laid eyes on. That's just my theory, but I think it's supported by our sighting of what I still to this day refer to as the Smoke Hole Dogman. Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com. And that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. We're working on figuring out how to add the $10 level to the PayPal club too. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.